Snow swept across Boston like a restless tide, curling through alleys and biting at exposed skin. Streetlights glowed through the flurries, halos of pale gold in the icy dark. Along the sidewalk, 3 little girls pressed close together, their small figures nearly swallowed by the storm. Their coats were too thin, their shoes soaked through, and their breaths came in trembling puffs. Sophie, the eldest by minutes, led the way with her jaw clenched, every step driven by the stubborn hope that somewhere, someone would see them. Laya followed, her sharp eyes scanning each passerby with suspicion. Grace, the smallest, clutched a worn teddy bear to her chest, whispering to it as if it could keep her warm. When the neon glow of a diner sign flickered ahead, the 3 girls stopped in the snow. The window glass shimmered with light and movement, families laughing, couples clinking coffee mugs, plates steaming with food. Grace's stomach growled loud enough to make her wince. "It smells so good," she murmured, her voice thin. Sophie squeezed her hand. "Come on. Let's try," she said, though her heart already knew how it might end. Laya hesitated, her breath fogging the glass as she whispered, "What if they call the police again?" The word hung in the air like a ghost. Police meant being taken away. Police meant losing each other. Sophie swallowed her fear and pushed open the diner door. The bell jingled softly, releasing a rush of warmth that hit their frozen skin like fire. For a moment they stood there, soaking it in. The red booths gleamed under golden light, the scent of butter and coffee wrapping around them. Grace's eyes widened in awe. They slid into the nearest booth, legs dangling above the floor, too nervous to speak. Slowly, the noise in the diner faded. Conversations stuttered. Eyes turned. A few whispered. The air thickened with something cold, judgment. Behind the counter, a man in his 50s set down a tray and frowned. Robert Hayes had worked in that diner for more than 20 years. Rules were rules and pity didn't pay the bills. He approached the girls, crouching slightly. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked quietly. Sophie straightened, her voice shaking. "No, sir. We're just hungry." Robert's sigh fogged the air between them. "I'm sorry, but I can't serve unaccompanied minors. It's policy." Grace's eyes welled with tears. Laya's hands balled into fists under the table. Sophie's voice cracked as she whispered, "Please. We haven't eaten in 3 days." Robert's face softened for a moment, then hardened again under the gaze of watching customers. "If you don't leave, I'll have to call the police." The word struck like thunder. Chairs scraped, whispers grew. The 3 girls froze, terror flooding their faces. Then Sophie grabbed her sister's hands and they ran. The bell clanged behind them as they burst into the night, snow swallowing their small footprints. They didn't stop until they turned into a narrow alley, huddling against a brick wall. Grace's tears streaked down her cheeks, freezing before they could fall. "Why doesn't anyone want us?" she whispered. Sophie pulled her close, though her own heart felt like breaking glass. Back inside the diner, a man in a dark coat stood up slowly from a corner booth. He had watched the entire scene, their pleading eyes, the manager's hesitation, the final desperate flight. His face was unreadable, but something inside him stirred, something buried long ago. Daniel Whitmore, one of the wealthiest men in Boston, left a few bills on the table and stepped into the storm. The cold air hit him like a memory of hunger, of nights spent praying someone would notice him. He followed the trail of small footprints vanishing into the snow, his breath heavy in the freezing dark. He didn't know why he was doing it, only that if he didn't, he might never forgive himself. Somewhere ahead, 3 frightened girls were running from the world, and Daniel was about to change theirs forever. The wind howled between the narrow alley walls, scattering torn paper and snow like fragments of a broken world. The 3 girls huddled together behind a dumpster, their breaths ragged clouds in the bitter air. Sophie's arm circled her sister's tightly, her body shaking more from fear than cold. She could still hear the manager's voice echoing in her head, the word police ringing like a curse. Grace whimpered softly, her small fingers gripping her teddy bear until the seams strained. Laya's eyes darted toward the alley mouth, every sound making her flinch. Then, through the blur of falling snow, footsteps approached. Heavy, steady, controlled. Sophie tensed, shoving her sisters behind her, her thin frame forming a wall between them and whoever was coming. "Stay back," she shouted, though her voice trembled. The figure stopped just beyond the reach of the alley light. A man's voice answered, calm and low. "It's all right." "I'm not here to hurt you." Daniel Whitmore stepped forward into the dim light, his breath visible in the frigid air. He kept his hands where they could see them, his movements deliberate, gentle. The soft glow from the diner window spilled faintly across his face, tired eyes, fine lines, a weariness that came from something deeper than age. He took another step closer, his voice quiet enough that it didn't echo. "I saw what happened in there. You don't have to run anymore." Sophie didn't relax. "People always say that," she snapped, her voice breaking midway. "Then they take us away." Daniel's heart twisted. Her defiance wasn't anger, it was survival. "You're right to be careful," he said. "But I promise I'm not one of them. I know what it's like to be cold, to be hungry." Laya narrowed her eyes. "No, you don't," she muttered. "You have a coat." "You smell like coffee." Daniel smiled faintly, not offended but understanding. "Maybe now," he said. "But when I was your age, I didn't even have shoes." He crouched down, careful not to move too fast. "Someone once helped me when I thought no one ever would. That's why I came after you." The snow fell heavier now, collecting on his shoulders, melting in the heat of his breath. The girls exchanged glances, the kind that needed no words. Grace peeked around Sophie's arm, her lips quivering. "Why would you help us?" she whispered. Daniel looked at her, and in her small face, he saw a reflection of the boy he had once been, alone, invisible, desperate for a kindness that didn't come with conditions. "Because someone once helped me," he said softly. "And because you shouldn't have to face the world alone." For a moment, silence ruled the alley. Then Grace sneezed, the tiny sound breaking the tension. Daniel extended his hand slowly toward Sophie, not touching, only offering. "Let me take you somewhere warm. Just for tonight. You can see everything for yourself, and if you don't feel safe, I'll take you wherever you want to go. I give you my word." Sophie's eyes flickered between his hand and his face, searching for deceit. There was none, only sincerity, tired and real. Behind her, Laya whispered, "If we stay here, Grace will get sick." Sophie swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. Finally, she nodded once, short and sharp. Daniel stood and gestured toward the diner's glowing sign across the street. "Come on," he said quietly. "You won't be alone this time." They followed him slowly, the smallest steps at first, then a hesitant walk. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they crossed the street. Daniel pushed open the diner door, and the bell jingled again. A sound that felt different now, less like rejection, more like a beginning. Every head turned as the same three children entered, this time with the well-dressed man who had been eating alone. Whispers rippled through the room, surprise and confusion mingling in the air. Robert Hayes froze mid-step, his mouth falling open. Daniel's gaze met his, calm but unwavering. "We need to talk," he said evenly. "Privately?" The manager nodded, stammering, "Oh, of course, sir." He led Daniel toward the back office, glancing nervously at the girls seated in a booth. Sophie kept her sisters close, her small hand trembling on the table's edge. Grace leaned her head against Laya's shoulder, whispering, "Do you think he'll come back?" Laya didn't answer, but she watched Daniel through the glass door, studying his every move like a hawk. Something about him, his stillness, his tone, felt different from anyone they'd met before. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't pretending. He was real. Minutes later, Daniel returned, his coat dusted with snow, a quiet authority in his step. "It's all taken care of," he said gently. "You can eat now." A waitress appeared almost instantly, setting down 3 steaming bowls of soup and slices of fresh bread. The girls stared, unsure if they were allowed to touch it. Daniel nodded. "Go ahead. It's yours." Grace took the first spoonful, closing her eyes as the warmth filled her chest. Sophie followed slower, still watching Daniel. He smiled faintly. "Go easy," he said softly. "When you've been hungry, the body needs time to remember what comfort feels like." The sound of spoons scraping bowls filled the silence. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside that diner, something fragile began to thaw, a trust that had been frozen for far too long. Daniel watched them quietly, unaware that this single act of kindness would lead him back to a past he thought was gone forever, and toward a truth that would change everything. The warmth of the diner wrapped around the three girls like a forgotten memory. Steam curled up from their soup bowls, and for the first time in days, the air didn't sting their lungs. Grace's tiny hands trembled as she held her spoon, but her eyes glowed with awe each time she took a bite. Sophie sat opposite Daniel, wary yet visibly softening. Her guard was still there, but exhaustion had cracked it just enough for kindness to slip through. Laya ate silently, one hand still clutching her sister's arm, her sharp eyes studying the man who had turned their night upside down. Daniel leaned back slightly, giving them space, letting the moment belong to them. Around them, conversation in the diner had resumed in cautious murmurs. A few customers watched with softened expressions, shame flickering in their eyes for the way they had stared earlier. Even the manager, Robert Hayes, avoided looking in Daniel's direction, still shaken by the quiet authority that had just rearranged his night. When Grace's spoon clattered softly against the bowl, she looked up. "Is this really okay?" she asked timidly, her voice no louder than the whisper of the storm outside. Daniel smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips. "Yes, eat as much as you need. You're safe here." He said it as if he wanted to believe it himself. The girls finished their soup, and Daniel ordered them slices of pie and hot chocolate. As the waitress placed the desserts down, she gave the girls a kind smile, the kind that said she, too, felt the weight of what she'd witnessed. Sophie muttered a soft, "Thank you," her first voluntary word since they'd returned inside. The simple sound hit Daniel like sunlight through a window after years of gray. While they ate, he asked gentle questions. Their names came first, hesitant, whispered like secrets: Sophie, Laya, Grace, then where they had come from. No one spoke for a long while until Laya finally said, "We don't have a home anymore." She said it bluntly, without drama, but the way her fingers tightened around her cup said everything. Daniel didn't push. He only nodded, his eyes lowering for a moment as if he carried the weight of their truth. "You have one tonight," he said quietly. "And as long as I'm breathing, you won't have to worry about the cold again." Sophie's fork froze midway to her mouth. She didn't answer, but something flickered across her face. Fear, hope, disbelief. "People always say nice things when they feel sorry," she murmured, not looking at him. "I don't do sorry," Daniel replied softly. "I do promises." Her eyes lifted to his then, meeting a gaze steady and calm, not pitying. He meant every word. By the time they left the diner, the snow had eased into a soft fall. Daniel held the door open, the wind brushing past them like a sigh. The night smelled faintly of smoke and rain, and the world seemed a little quieter. He walked slowly beside them, never too close, always matching their uncertain pace. Parked along the curb was a sleek black sedan, its headlights glowing faintly. Grace gasped when she saw it. "Is this your car?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "It's warmer inside." "Come on," Sophie hesitated. "Where are you taking us?" "Somewhere safe," he said simply. "You'll all stay together. I promise." That word again, promise. It made Sophie's chest ache. She looked at her sisters. Laya's eyes were locked on Daniel's, searching for deceit and finding none. Grace hugged her teddy bear tighter. "Can we bring Mr. Bear?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "Of course. He gets the window seat." The smallest laugh escaped her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the air feel lighter. Inside the car, the heat hummed softly. The seats were far too big for the three of them, and the leather seemed to swallow their tiny bodies whole. Daniel adjusted the temperature, glancing at them in the mirror. Grace leaned against Laya's shoulder, already half asleep. Sophie stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white. As the car began to move, Daniel spoke quietly. "You remind me of someone," he said. "Who?" Sophie asked, not looking at him. "Someone who once helped me when I had nothing. She gave me food, a place to stay, and told me that life could change in a single act of kindness. Did it?" Laya asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "It did. It saved me." The girls said nothing after that. The car glided through the sleeping city, headlights slicing through drifting snow. The noise of traffic faded behind them, replaced by the soft hum of tires against wet asphalt. For Daniel, the drive felt like moving between two worlds. The man he used to be, and the man fate had just reminded him he could still become. As they crossed the bridge into Cambridge, the skyline disappeared behind them, replaced by long stretches of quiet streets and tall gated homes. The car turned down a private drive lined with frosted trees, the kind that glittered under the moonlight like frozen glass. At the end stood a mansion of warm lights and stillness, a house built on success, but empty of laughter. Sophie's breath fogged the window as she stared. "You live here?" "Yes," Daniel answered softly, easing the car to a stop. "And tonight it's your home too." He stepped out first, his boots crunching in the snow, then opened their door. The triplets didn't move at first, staring up at the towering home, uncertain if they were dreaming. But Daniel didn't rush them. He simply stood there, letting them decide when to trust the moment. Finally, Sophie took Grace's hand and stepped out. Laya followed, eyes darting from the grand doorway to the man beside them. For the first time in their lives, the cold didn't feel endless. The snow kept falling, but something inside them, fragile, trembling, had begun to thaw. As the front door opened and warm light spilled across the steps, Daniel whispered to himself, unheard over the wind, "You saved me once, Rachel. Maybe this is how I save them." He didn't yet know how deeply those words would come to mean. The front door opened before Daniel could even reach for the handle. Margaret stood there, her gray hair pinned neatly, a soft shawl draped around her shoulders. Her eyes widened at the sight of the three small figures half hidden behind Daniel's coat. "Good heavens!" she breathed, stepping aside instantly. "Bring them in, Mr. Whitmore. They're frozen to the bone." The warmth of the foyer hit like a gentle wave. The marble floor gleamed, chandeliers glittered above, and the faint scent of pine and cinnamon lingered from the holiday decorations Daniel had barely noticed all season. To the girls, it felt like stepping into another world, too bright, too grand, too clean to be real. Their reflection shimmered faintly on the polished floor. Three little shadows who didn't belong in a place like this. Grace pressed her teddy bear to her chest and whispered, "Are we allowed to be here?" Daniel crouched down so his eyes met hers. "Yes, sweetheart," he said quietly. "You belong here now. All of you." Margaret clucked her tongue as she ushered them toward the parlor. "Poor things, they're trembling like leaves. I'll draw them a bath and find something warm to wear. I think some of my daughter's old clothes are still stored upstairs." The girls followed her uncertainly, Sophie's hand gripping her sister's tightly. As they passed a wall of framed photographs and oil paintings, Laya slowed, staring at the faces. People smiling, families gathered in sunlight. She didn't say it aloud, but she wondered what it must be like to live in a world where every photograph was proof that you belonged somewhere. In the pink guest room at the far end of the east wing, Margaret turned on a lamp, flooding the room with a soft glow. The bed was enormous, its blankets thick and inviting. "Now don't you worry about the mess," she said kindly. "We'll warm the water for a bath and I'll bring you some clean pajamas." When the door closed, Sophie ran her hand across the silk bedspread, her face unreadable. Grace climbed onto the mattress and sank into the covers with a little sigh, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. "It's so soft," she whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. Laya stood by the window, watching snow drift past the glowing garden lamps outside. "Why is he doing this?" she asked under her breath. "People don't just help strangers. Not like this." Sophie looked at her sister, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe he's not like other people." Downstairs, Daniel stood at his study window, his reflection caught in the dark glass. The storm had eased, but inside him something else stirred, a storm of memories. He could still see flashes of his own childhood, the cold streets of South Boston, the sound of his mother's cough echoing in a freezing apartment, the night she pressed her last $5 into his palm and whispered, "Make it mean something." Danny. He had built an empire since then, buildings that scraped the sky, ventures that made headlines. But somehow, in all that noise, he had forgotten what her words meant. Until tonight, Margaret appeared quietly at the door. "They're in the bath now," she said softly. "You did the right thing bringing them here," Daniel exhaled, nodding. "I hope so. They've been through something no child should." Margaret gave him a look, part affection, part worry. "You always did have a soft spot for the lost ones," she said. "You see too much of yourself in them." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the point." When Margaret left, Daniel sat at his desk, opening his laptop. He began searching. Names, orphan records, missing persons reports, hospitals. Nothing. It was as if the three girls didn't exist. Whoever they were, their past was buried deep. Upstairs, laughter echoed faintly through the halls, tentative, uncertain, but laughter nonetheless. The sound pulled at something in Daniel's chest he hadn't felt in years. He closed the laptop and walked toward the grand staircase. Margaret was there again, helping the girls into oversized pajamas that smelled faintly of lavender. Their hair was damp, their cheeks pink from the warmth. Sophie immediately tensed when she saw him at the door, but Daniel raised a reassuring hand. "Just wanted to make sure you're all right," he said quietly. Grace blinked sleepily at him. "It's warm," she mumbled, curling into the blanket. "I'm glad," Daniel said, his voice softening. As he turned to leave, Sophie's voice stopped him. "Are you really going to let us stay?" He looked back at her, the weight of the question heavy between them. "For as long as you need," he said. "That's a promise." When the girls finally fell asleep, their three small bodies huddled together in the massive bed, Daniel lingered at the doorway. Their breathing was slow and steady, their faces unguarded for the first time since he'd met them. He stood there for a long time, feeling something shift deep within him. The house, once echoing with silence, seemed alive again. He returned to his study, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stared into the fire. The flames danced in the reflection of the window, mirroring his thoughts. Flickering, restless, uncertain. He knew that this night had altered something irrevocably. It wasn't just about feeding hungry children. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. Outside, the snow had stopped. The moon hung above the estate like a silver coin in a velvet sky. Upstairs, the triplets slept in a pink room that smelled of soap and safety. And downstairs, a man who had everything sat in the quiet realization that, for the first time in years, his heart was no longer empty. What he didn't know yet was that this newfound warmth would soon uncover a truth he never expected, one that would reach straight into the buried corners of his past and change the meaning of everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and destiny. The night deepened into stillness, the kind of hush that feels almost holy after a storm. The snow outside Daniel's mansion lay untouched now, blanketing the world in fragile peace. Inside, a different quiet filled the halls, the slow rhythm of three children breathing safely in their sleep. But Daniel couldn't rest. He sat in his study, the glow of the fire flickering across his face, casting long shadows that seemed to move with his thoughts. He stared at his laptop screen where search results filled the page. Names, records, fragments of lives. Every clue felt like a whisper that refused to turn into a full sentence. He typed their mother's name again, Rachel Carter, and waited as if the machine could give him absolution. The cursor blinked. Then a single obituary appeared. Rachel Carter, age 32, passed away 2 months earlier after a battle with leukemia, survived by her 3 daughters. No father listed. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the breath leaving his chest as if the room itself had taken it. Rachel Carter, The name echoed through him like a memory he'd buried under too many years of boardrooms and empty victories. He rose from his chair, crossing to the window, his reflection in the glass now almost unrecognizable to him. He remembered a small diner, not this one, but another, years ago, before he had a car, before he had a company, before he was anything but a desperate young man with empty pockets. Rachel had worked there, always with her hair tied up, always humming as she poured coffee. She was the one who had given him his first meal in days, no questions asked. She had smiled at him as if kindness were effortless. "You'll do something great one day, Daniel," she'd said once, handing him a sandwich he couldn't afford. "Just promise me you'll still be human when you do." Now, as he looked at the glowing embers in the fireplace, those words landed heavier than ever. He whispered them aloud. Still be human. He hadn't thought about her in years, had forced himself not to. When she disappeared without a word, he told himself she had moved on. But fate had a cruel precision. The triplets sleeping upstairs, Sophie, Laya, Grace, carried her eyes. He sank back into his chair, staring at the photograph he'd found on an old news site, a faded image of Rachel holding 3 newborns in a hospital room. Her smile was the same, warm and unguarded. He traced her face on the screen, his throat tightening. The realization came like lightning through his chest. The girls weren't just strangers he'd helped out of pity. They were the daughters of the only woman who had ever truly seen him. Upstairs, floorboards creaked softly. Daniel looked up and saw a small figure at the edge of the hallway. Sophie stood there barefoot, her hair a tangled halo of curls, her eyes wide but unafraid. "You're awake," Daniel said gently. She nodded, stepping closer. "I couldn't sleep." She hesitated, glancing at the papers on his desk. "You're looking for us, aren't you?" Daniel smiled sadly. "I'm trying to understand where you came from." Sophie's lip trembled, and for the first time her guard cracked. "Mom always said not to trust anyone, but I think she would have liked you." Daniel's heart tightened. "I knew your mother," he said quietly. "A long time ago," Sophie froze, blinking up at him. "You did?" He nodded, his voice rough. "She was the reason I became who I am." The silence that followed felt sacred. Sophie looked at the photograph on his desk, studying it. "That's her," she whispered. "She used to sing to us before bed." Daniel swallowed the ache in his throat. "She was kind. Braver than anyone I ever met." Sophie's eyes shimmered in the firelight. "She used to say that kindness is what makes us strong, even when people think it makes us weak." Daniel smiled through the blur of tears he didn't try to hide. She never stopped believing that. Sophie reached out, placing her small hand over his. "Then maybe she sent you." The words hit him like a revelation. Maybe she had. Maybe the universe had found a way to return the gift he owed her, to let him repay a debt that could never be measured in money or success. When Sophie padded back up the stairs, Daniel sat motionless, the fire crackling softly beside him. His mind no longer felt heavy. It felt alive, urgent, purposeful. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Charles," he said when a sleepy voice answered. "It's Daniel Whitmore. I need your help." 3 girls. Their mother's gone. Their stepfather. "I don't trust the story. Find everything. Records, witnesses, anything that explains what they've been through." He hung up and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profits or investors. He was thinking about a promise, upstairs. In the pink room, Sophie lay awake between her sisters, listening to the sound of the house breathing, soft creaks, distant firelight, a man's footsteps fading down the hall. Her heart still raced, but not from fear. It was something else now. Something new, hope. Morning crept quietly across the Whitmore estate, pouring pale light through the tall windows. Frost clung to the garden glass like lace. The world outside glittered white, but inside the house felt softer, alive with faint sounds, Margaret humming in the kitchen, the creak of old wood, and the low murmur of voices that hadn't filled these halls in years. Daniel hadn't slept. He sat in his study, unshaven, his coffee cold, surrounded by files and photographs Charles had delivered just before dawn. The investigator had done his work well, too well. Every page deepened the ache in Daniel's chest. Rachel Carter's life unfolded before him in snapshots. A kind-hearted mother, a struggling widow, a woman who had fought illness and poverty to keep her daughters safe. Her husband, Thomas Weber, appeared in the reports too. Angry eyes, a string of police calls for domestic disputes, and neighbors' statements that spoke of shouting, bruises, fear. The girls had run the night he tried to separate them after Rachel's death. Daniel closed the file slowly, his hands trembling. "You did everything alone," he whispered to Rachel's picture, his voice thick. "And I wasn't there to help you." He pressed his fingers to his temples, fighting the guilt that clawed at him. She had once saved him from hunger, from hopelessness, and he hadn't even known she needed saving in return. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door creaked open, and there they were, Sophie, Laya, and Grace, dressed in the clean clothes Margaret had found, their hair brushed, their eyes still shadowed with uncertainty. Sophie stood slightly ahead of her sisters, her posture protective. "Margaret said you didn't eat breakfast," she said softly. Daniel blinked, startled by her quiet authority. "I suppose I forgot," he said, forcing a small smile. Grace wandered closer, her teddy bear dangling from one arm. "Are you sad?" she asked, tilting her head. Daniel hesitated. "A little. I was thinking about your mother." That made all three of them still. Sophie's breath caught. "You knew her, didn't you?" Daniel gestured toward the open file. "Yes," he said quietly. "A long time ago, she was extraordinary." Laya stepped closer, her expression sharp. "Why didn't you find us sooner?" He looked up at her, the boldest of the three, and didn't try to dodge the question. "Because I didn't know you existed. If I had, nothing could have kept me away." The answer came out raw, unpolished, and real. Laya searched his face for any hint of a lie but found none. Grace climbed onto his knee without asking, resting her head against his chest. Sophie stood motionless for a long moment before saying, "She always said there was someone who made her believe in good people. Was that you?" Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But she made me believe in them too." The room fell into gentle silence. The fire crackled softly. The girls seemed to sense that something heavy had shifted, that the man who had rescued them wasn't just a stranger but a piece of their lost story. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove them through the city. The snow had turned to slush, but sunlight glinted off every surface, blinding and bright. They stopped outside a modest retirement home on the outskirts of Cambridge. Sophie looked up at him, confused. "Where are we?" "There's someone I think you should meet," Daniel said. Inside, a nurse led them down a hallway lined with framed paintings and potted ferns. The smell of coffee and antiseptic hung faintly in the air. At the end of the corridor, an elderly woman sat by a window, her gray hair pulled into a bun, a blanket draped across her knees. When she turned, her eyes widened. "Rachel?" she whispered, for a fleeting second mistaking Sophie for her daughter. Sophie froze, her sisters pressing against her sides. Daniel stepped forward gently. "Mrs. Carter?" The old woman's hand trembled as she reached for her glasses. "You," she murmured, her voice cracking. "Daniel Whitmore. I thought I'd never see you again." He nodded, emotion flooding his voice. "They're Rachel's daughters." Sarah Carter's gaze shifted to the triplets, and her composure broke. Tears streamed down her lined cheeks as she whispered, "My grandbabies." She struggled to stand, and Sophie rushed to steady her. For a moment, the past and present collided. The grandmother who'd lost her daughter, the children who'd lost their mother, and the man who had once loved her and never truly let her go. Sarah cupped Laya's face, her thumb brushing away tears. "You have her eyes," she whispered. Grace leaned into her embrace like she'd known her all her life. Daniel stood a few steps back, watching through the blur of tears he couldn't hide. He'd brought them here to find a piece of their history, but he hadn't expected how much of his own heart would be caught in it. After a long while, Sarah looked at him, You kept your promise, she said softly. You're still human. The words hit him with quiet finality, the same words Rachel had spoken decades ago when she'd saved a hungry boy with a paper cup of coffee and faith in his future. As the girls sat with their grandmother, the light outside the window turned golden. Daniel looked at them, 3 small souls who had lost everything but somehow found their way back to love. And for the first time since he could remember, he understood what it meant to be rich, not in the currency of the world, but in the currency of second chances. He turned toward the window, watching the sunlight spill across the snow. In its reflection, he saw Rachel's smile, faint but unmistakable, and the whisper of her voice. You're doing it right this time. He closed his eyes and let the warmth of it settle in his chest. For years, he had built towers that reached the sky. But tonight, he realized the tallest thing he'd ever build was the family standing right in front of him. The following weeks unfolded like a fragile dream that refused to fade. The girls' laughter began to echo through the Whitmore estate, weaving through the once-empty corridors like music Daniel had forgotten how to hear. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting warm ribbons across the marble floors where Grace's drawings lay scattered. Crayon hearts, clumsy stars and stick figures labeled Sophie, Laya, Grace, and Daddy Daniel. He had never told her to call him that. It had just happened one afternoon when she ran to him after tripping in the garden. The word slipped out, trembling but sure, and something deep inside him, something he thought long buried, stirred back to life. But beneath the peace, the storm still waited. Charles returned one cold evening, his coat still damp from the sleet outside. Daniel ushered him into the study. "What did you find?" he asked. Charles placed a thick envelope on the desk, his expression grim. Their stepfather, Thomas Weber, filed for custody through the state. He's claiming the girls as his legal dependents. He knows they're with you. Daniel's jaw tightened. He can't have them. He's not fit, Charles agreed. But the court doesn't know that. They only see a man with paperwork, claiming his wife's children. You're not family, at least not on paper. The fire snapped in the grate. Daniel stared into it for a long moment, then looked up. Then we'll change that. The following week was a blur of legal meetings, background checks, and statements. Sophie watched it all quietly, her small face drawn with worry. "Are they going to take us away?" she asked one evening when Daniel sat with her in the library. He shook his head. "Not if I can help it." She studied him, then whispered, "You always say that. You always promise." He smiled faintly. "And have I ever broken one?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No." At that, Daniel reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a folded photograph. "This was your mother," he said, passing it to her. The picture showed a younger Rachel sitting on a park bench, sunlight in her hair. Sophie traced the edges of the photo with trembling fingers. "She looks happy," she whispered. "She was," Daniel said softly. "She believed the world could be kind. That's why I'm fighting, for her and for you." The day of the custody hearing arrived with a sky heavy with gray clouds. Daniel drove them to the courthouse himself. Grace sat in the back seat, hugging her bear. Laya stared out the window, lips pressed tight. Sophie held Daniel's hand, silent but unflinching. Inside the courtroom, Thomas Weber stood with a lawyer beside him. His suit was pressed, his hair slicked back, but his eyes betrayed the kind of rage that simmers just beneath the surface. When his gaze landed on Daniel and the girls, his lips twisted. "So this is where they ended up," he sneered. Living with a billionaire who thinks money makes him a savior, Daniel's voice remained calm. "Money doesn't make anyone a savior, Mr. Weber. Compassion does." The judge entered and the room fell silent. What followed was a blur of testimony and evidence. Charles presented reports from neighbors who had heard the fights, police statements, and hospital notes from Rachel's last months. When the judge asked to hear from Sophie, Daniel's breath caught. She was barely 7, but her words were steady. "We ran because he said he'd send us away," she said softly. "He said sisters don't belong together when there's too many mouths to feed. But Daniel..." She glanced back at him. He never told us to be quiet. He just listened. Grace clutched her bear tighter. Even Laya, who had promised herself not to cry, wiped her eyes. When the judge finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that could end nightmares. Given the evidence of neglect and abuse, custody of Sophie, Laya, and Grace Carter will be granted to Mr. Daniel Whitmore, effective immediately. The words hung in the air like a sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Grace let out a small gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. Laya exhaled shakily, and Sophie turned to Daniel, tears spilling down her cheeks. He knelt beside them, wrapping all three girls in his arms. "You said we wouldn't be separated," Sophie whispered against his shoulder. Daniel's voice cracked as he answered, "And now you never will be." Across the room, Thomas Weber stormed out, his footsteps echoing like fading thunder. But Daniel didn't watch him leave. His world was right here, three small lives clinging to him as if they finally understood that they were safe, that the running was over. Outside the courthouse, the clouds broke open just enough for a sliver of sunlight to pierce through. Margaret was waiting with a thermos of cocoa, tears glistening in her eyes when she saw them. "Well," she said softly, "it looks like the Whitmore family just got a little bigger." That night, the house felt different, not just fuller, but alive in a way Daniel couldn't explain. He walked past the girls' bedroom after tucking them in. Grace was already asleep, her bear tucked under her chin. Laya lay awake, reading by the faint glow of a lamp, her once defensive eyes calm. Sophie was in the middle, holding both their hands. Daniel lingered in the doorway, his chest tight with something between joy and disbelief. He had spent his life chasing success, thinking it would fill the silence. But this quiet, imperfect, beautiful peace, was what he had been searching for all along. In the living room, the fire burned low, its light flickering over the photograph of Rachel on the mantel. Daniel touched the frame gently, his voice barely a whisper. "I kept my promise, Rachel. They're home." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow, not as a storm, but as a benediction, a quiet blessing on a family, rebuilt from loss and the man who had finally remembered what it meant to be human. Spring sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, flooding the rooms with warmth and color. Outside, the snow had long melted into the earth, and the garden, once pale and frozen, now hummed with life. Tulips swayed beside the fountain, birds sang in the oaks, and laughter rang through the air like wind chimes. Sophie, Laya, and Grace chased each other across the lawn, ribbons streaming from their hair. For the first time in their young lives, joy was no longer borrowed. It belonged to them. Daniel watched from the veranda, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The sunlight caught the silver in his hair, but his eyes, once cold and distant, glowed with something warm, peace. Margaret brought him a cup of tea and set it beside him, following his gaze toward the garden. "They're different now," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "So am I." He had meant it. The man who once measured life in contracts and profit margins now measured it in giggles echoing down hallways, in bedtime stories that ended with whispered goodnights, in small hands that reached for his without hesitation. But his peace wasn't idle. The promise he had made, to Rachel, to those three little girls, was becoming something far bigger. That morning, the press gathered outside the downtown auditorium where Daniel Whitmore was scheduled to make an announcement. Rumors had spread fast. The reclusive billionaire who'd built a global empire was about to reveal his most personal project yet. When he took the stage, he didn't speak like the mogul they expected. No sleek suit, no teleprompter. Just Daniel, calm, steady, his voice carrying through the hall like a quiet confession. "There was a time," he began, "when I believed success was about how high you could build, how much you could own. But I was wrong. True success is measured by how deeply you can love and how many lives you can lift." Behind him, the screen flickered to life with the foundation's name, the Rachel Carter Foundation. The crowd leaned forward. "This foundation," Daniel continued, "is named for a woman who changed my life. Decades ago, when I was cold and hungry, she offered me kindness without asking for anything in return. Because of her, I survived. Because of her, I became the man I am. Today, her spirit lives on through her daughters, Sophie, Leia, and Grace, and through every child we will help. At that cue, the curtains parted. The triplets walked onto the stage holding hands. Their dresses were simple white, their faces glowing under the lights. The audience stood in silence before the applause began, soft at first, then thunderous. Sophie stepped up to the microphone. Her small voice carried through the room. We know what it's like to be hungry. We know what it's like to be scared. But we also know what it's like when someone doesn't give up on you. Leia followed, her tone steady and clear. This foundation isn't about money. It's about giving kids like us a chance to dream again. Grace clung to Daniel's hand, looking up at him as she whispered, "And it's about love." The audience rose to their feet, moved not by spectacle but by sincerity. Cameras flashed, but Daniel didn't see them. He saw Rachel's smile and Sophie's determination, her grace in Leia's boldness, her warmth in Grace's laughter. By evening, news outlets around the world carried the story. Billionaire creates foundation in memory of lost love, vows no child will face hunger or separation. Donations poured in within hours. But for Daniel, it wasn't about the money, it was about the promise fulfilled. That night, as the house settled into quiet, Daniel found himself standing in the garden beneath a sky full of stars. The air smelled of fresh rain and jasmine. Sarah Carter sat on the porch, humming softly as she watched her granddaughters chase fireflies. The sight made Daniel's chest ache with gratitude. He closed his eyes, tilting his head toward the heavens. "I kept my word, Rachel," he whispered. "They're safe. They're loved. You can rest now." A soft breeze brushed past him, stirring the wind chimes on the porch. For a heartbeat, he could almost hear her laughter, gentle, approving, eternal. Sophie ran up to him, her cheeks flushed with joy. "Daddy, come see?" she cried. "Grace caught a firefly." He turned, smiling through tears he didn't bother to hide. "I'm coming, sweetheart." As he lifted Grace into his arms, the firefly's light glowed between their hands, flickering like a heartbeat. Leia laughed, Sophie twirled, and Sarah's voice called them in for supper. The lights of the house shimmered in the distance, warm, alive, full. Daniel looked once more at the stars, then at the 3 little girls who had turned his emptiness into purpose. The world might remember him as a billionaire, but to Sophie, Leia, and Grace, he was simply the man who kept a promise. And in the quiet rhythm of that truth, Daniel Whitmore finally found everything he'd spent his whole life searching for. Not fortune, not fame, but family. The kind that no amount of winter could ever take away again.